Most people hear national security strategy and their eyes close in 5 seconds. Boring paper, diplomatic language, nobody cares. This one is different. This one basically says the Western Hemisphere is ours. Full stop. And Canada? Canada is not a friendly neighbor in this text. Canada is real estate inside somebody else's backyard. Let's unpack it slowly. Every US administration publishes one of these strategies. Usually, it's written by committees. Every sentence sanded down, full of phrases like shared values and mutual prosperity. You read it, you forget it. Trump's new document is short, blunt, and very direct. You can feel it was written by a small group who didn't care about diplomatic poetry. And at the center of it is an old ghost from 1823. The Monroe Doctrine. Back then, Monroe basically told Europe, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. No new colonies, no new adventures. This side of the Atlantic is our sphere of interest. The US at that time did not really have the muscle to fully enforce it, but the idea was planted. Later, Theodore Roosevelt turned this into something harsher. Not just Europe stay out, but we reserve the right to intervene in Latin America ourselves if things go wrong. So first you have, this is our neighborhood. Then you have, and we are also the neighborhood police. Now jump to 2025. Trump adds his own extension. Call it a Trump corollary if you like. The message is, the whole hemisphere is our backyard. South America, Central America, the Caribbean, and by implication, Canada and the Arctic. And then comes the really interesting phrase, not just no foreign interference, but no foreign assets in this hemisphere. No foreign assets. On paper, this is aimed at rivals. China, maybe Russia, maybe others. But think like a lawyer for a moment. What is a foreign asset? A Chinese-owned port terminal in Vancouver? A European company running a critical mine in Quebec, a foreign firm owning pieces of telecoms, power grids, airports, LNG terminals. You see the problem. If Washington defines foreign assets as a security threat, then your ordinary economic decisions suddenly become matters of national security for someone else's capital. And this is where Canada feels the heat. The document also talks about assured access for American forces to key routes and locations in the hemisphere, and preserving freedom of navigation in all crucial sea lanes. On one level, this is standard US language. You can find it in many strategies. But here it's tied directly to the Western Hemisphere, and that leads us to the Arctic and the famous Northwest Passage. For decades, Canada and the US have had a very polite disagreement over what the Northwest Passage actually is in legal terms. Canada says, these are our internal waters, like a river or a bay entirely inside Canadian territory. Our laws, our control. You want to pass through, you talk to Ottawa. The United States says, no, this is an international strait. That means any ship can transit without asking permission as long as it follows basic rules. Because relations were friendly, both sides agreed to disagree. They made practical arrangements, cooperated through NORAD, did joint exercises, and avoided turning it into a public fight. Now, put this new language from Washington on the table. Access, freedom of navigation, no foreign competitors controlling strategic assets, all wrapped inside the revived Monroe Doctrine. That sounds less like two neighbors with a technical dispute, and more like one great power saying, the key Arctic routes are part of our strategic freedom of movement. We intend to be there, and we intend to stay. And remember, climate change is turning the Arctic from frozen wall into seasonal maritime highway. Shorter shipping routes between Asia and Europe, huge untapped energy reserves, critical minerals. What used to be a theoretical legal debate is becoming a very practical question of who sets the rules, who charges the fees, who controls the ports, and who can say no to whose navy. So when you read this strategy as a Canadian policymaker, you don't just see nice words about partnership. You see a neighbor effectively saying, "We claim the right to block foreign players from buying strategic assets in your country, and we expect guaranteed access through your Arctic waters." Is this the end of Canada's sovereignty? No. Canada is still a sovereign state. Nobody is rolling tanks across the border. But sovereignty is not just about flags and passports. It is about how many real choices you have when a bigger power tells you what it considers non-negotiable. Now zoom out from Canada to the whole map. The logic of this doctrine is very simple, very old, and very dangerous. Spheres of influence. The world is divided into zones, where one big power is boss and everybody else adjusts. Roughly, it looks like this. The United States claims the Western Hemisphere, from Patagonia to the Arctic. China is assumed to dominate East Asia and its neighborhood. Russia is treated as the main force across parts of Eastern Europe and Eurasia, at least in theory. This is why some analysts call it a three-bully world. Three big players, each bullying their near neighbors, trading quiet understandings. We don't interfere in your zone, you don't interfere in ours. In public, everyone still uses the language of democracy, rules-based order, international law. In practice, the new strategy says, forget these nice words, power decides. For Canada, this is especially uncomfortable because Canada has built its identity partly on multilateralism. Alliances, international law, climate diplomacy, peacekeeping, cooperation with Europe and Asia. Now Washington is effectively saying, yes, yes, all very nice, but on anything that touches critical minerals, energy infrastructure, sea lanes, telecoms, Arctic bases, great power competition, we expect you to line up with us, and we may treat your foreign partners as security risks inside our hemisphere. So what happens next? First, you will likely see growing pressure on Ottawa to tighten its screening of foreign investments in ports, mines, rare earth projects, data centers, and telecoms. Not just for Canada's own reasons, but to match US red lines. Second, expect more US presence in the Arctic. More Coast Guard, more Navy, more joint patrols, maybe even freedom of navigation operations, framed in polite language but carrying a simple message. We consider this an international route. Third, Canada will be pushed to spend more on defense in the north, but under a strategic framework increasingly written in Washington. More capability, yes, but within someone else's doctrine. And for ordinary Canadians, this will show up in ways that seem far from geopolitics. Which companies win contracts? Where new ports are built? What kind of ships cross your waters? Who owns the infrastructure that moves your data, your food, your fuel? The deeper lesson here is not only about Trump or Canada. It is about what happens when a global system built on the idea of universal rules slides back into a map of zones of control. When big powers talk about doctrine, they are not writing philosophy. They are marking territory. The question for countries like Canada, and frankly for most of the world, is simple. How do you live next to a superpower that now says openly, "This whole neighborhood is mine," while still keeping real choices about your economy, your alliances, and your future? That battle is not fought with dramatic headlines about annexation. It is fought in quiet investment reviews, obscure maritime notes, a few loaded words like access and assets in a strategy document. Geography does not care about your feelings, but how you respond, how calmly and clearly you defend your own space, that still matters. We are going back to 19th century language with 21st century weapons and climate. That combination should make everybody pay attention. In Ottawa, in Washington, and in every small country that suddenly discovers it lives in someone else's sphere of influence. thehub.ca